For those of you that have seen some of our earlier segments on demographics, I think you realize that I'm like a kid in a candy store now. I found demographics, and to me, they don't explain politics, but I think if you don't understand demographics, you can't understand politics. So we've had some shows where we've talked about some current topics in demographics, and particularly focused on the millennials, the generation that's coming of political age, and who I think is going to really shape the future of American politics for so many reasons. So we're lucky today to have an expert on demographics who's going to allow us to drill down and talk about the political aspects of these millennials and hopefully get off into some really interesting tangents. So with us today, welcome, we have Karlyn Bowman. And Karlyn, I have to tell you, I had more fun preparing for today's interview than any interview I've ever had before.
That's terrific.
But I was thinking back, I'm going to date myself. I'm not going to date you.
Okay.
There used to be a show on television called What's My Line?
Mm-hmm.
And people would sit on the show and they had to guess what their line was.
Right.
I think you would have won the show because I don't think anybody would have guessed your line. So you are an expert in public opinion, and that's terrific. And for our viewers, can I go back to this camera?
You're on it.
All right. And for our viewers, Karlyn is a senior fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. She is a regular writer and contributor to Forbes.com, and she is a prolific writer. In fact, that's why I had so much fun getting ready for the interview, because I loved going and reading her materials. So anyway, Karlyn Bowman is our guest, and welcome, Karlyn.
Thank you.
So I guess the obvious first question is, how does one become an expert on public opinion?
Well, I'm not a pollster, and I actually came to it through the back door. I took a position as a very junior editor on a magazine that the American Enterprise Institute was publishing called Public Opinion, so I learned the business by doing it.
Well, what would have been your background then for that? Did you study something in college or
I'm not a
post-college?
statistics major. I don't have that background at all, and so I just had to learn it by doing.
In some ways, that's almost that's the best way to come at a topic, because you don't come with any preconceived notions of what you're doing. So you have to almost invent it, and in inventing it, you bring your own personal style to the
That's
table,
right. And I've been looking at it for a long time, and I find certain things more interesting than others. And it's always interesting because public opinion is always changing, and there's always something new. It's public opinion on the police this week. It's public opinion on the president's views in foreign policy the week before. So it's always changing. So it's really interesting.
And that's why I said I had so much fun preparing for the interview, because you get to pick your slant.
I do.
And you write such interesting things. So that's great.
Good.
Now you mentioned the president, and I think I'm going to find a quote here. I don't know where it was. That on the American Institute page, it says you have I don't know. Can't find my quote, guys. We'll have to cut this out at some point, huh? I had a quote about you. Let me find my quote. Oh, okay, guys. Ready?
Yeah, we're ready.
Okay. So when I was on the AEI site, it says, I'm going to read this, Ms. Bowman, and I'm paraphrasing, has studied the evolution of American politics because of key demographic changes. So are you maybe the only person or one of the few people that is marrying demographics in politics? Are there other people that have
I don't think there are too many people that are marrying demographics and public opinion.
Public opinion, yeah.
There's certainly other experts. Bill Fry at the Brookings Institution is a wonderful demographer. Rui Teixeira at the Center for American Progress marries public opinion and demographic data, but there are not too many of us doing that.
So do the 3 or 4 of you get to dinner every once in a while and divide up the world? And,
We had lunch this week, but on another project.
well, before the show, I told you, I have to ask you the question that's the burning question to me all the time is why Americans don't vote. I don't know if you've studied or thought about it, but I figured I should at least pick your brain to find out.
Well, I've thought about it a lot, and let me throw out something that might surprise you. Is it because we're satisfied or we're not dissatisfied enough? There's a lot of evidence that Americans don't vote because they perhaps don't think things will change. That's certainly a negative view, but that they're not dissatisfied enough to go out to vote out whoever's in office. So I'm just wondering if it's, and again, this is not something there's a lot of literature on, but looking at public opinion data as I do, I know that people vote when they're mad, when they want to change something. And perhaps people are really dissatisfied right now, but not dissatisfied enough to really want to make some significant changes.
Now, given, again, we were talking about the current period we've been living through, given this period and the level of dissatisfaction, does it not then, if that level can't kick it up enough for people to vote, what can?
I'm not sure what will kick it up. Certainly it kicked up in 2008, and that was a surprise to many political scientists and others. And so I think if people think there's enough at stake voting for the first African-American president, they'll come out to vote.
But even still, as we said,
Still
based
low.
on historical patterns pre-60 or so,
That's right.
it was still relatively low.
That's right.
And then
yeah.
now we're in the midterm cycle,
And it will
and
be
it's as
even
low as
lower
ever
still.
been, right?
It will be very, very low. Certainly the primary turnout is the lowest it's ever been thus far. Only about 15% of Americans turned out in the first 25 primaries.
So when you go back to 2008, people should have been upset then because we had the Great Recession. Then we had this massive shift, to President Obama running for Congress, and first minority candidate, et cetera, et cetera. So that did tick up a bit. But then you have the drop off for the midterms. Do people not care who their governor is or U.S. senator?
Well,
I mean,
interestingly, there's a lot more satisfaction with governors than there is with Washington these days. Governors seem to be more accountable to people. They have to balance budgets in many cases. They can't get around difficult problems, and they can't put them off. And so I would say there's actually more satisfaction with governors than there is with Washington today. No question about it.
one of the themes of our show is we talk about dysfunction. And I've, in my mind, been marrying dysfunction and polarization and lack of voting. So when I think about it, I say people don't vote on one hand, and then we have what we call on the show incumbency protection elements. Campaign finance, redistricting, which I don't think many people understand, but people, the phrase I'm hearing more and more is the elected officials are choosing who they're going to represent, not the other way around. So you have this system where there's very few contested races, and particularly in Congress this year, on one of our last shows, people from Ballotpedia are predicting as few as 30 contested races. So if you have people not voting, you have incumbency protection. To a certain extent, does public opinion matter anymore? And the second question, the follow-up is, do our public officials have to pay attention to it if they're going to just keep their jobs anyway?
Well, certainly most people are in districts that are pretty safe. Someone once compared it to the Politburo, that about 98% of those who seek re-election are re-elected to office. They represent their districts pretty well. They understand the public opinion in their districts. But I would argue that politicians still pay an enormous amount of attention to public opinion. I mean, President Obama clearly knows that he's suffering in a number of regards these days. I'm not sure he's an avid consumer of public opinion polls, but certainly the people around him are. And he has to be concerned about his overall approval rating. I mean, that's not necessarily the way he ought to govern, but certainly politicians pay attention to polls. I don't think they hold their fingers up to the wind and change their minds based on what they've seen in public opinion polls, but I think they have to be conscious of it, even in a system with the 400-odd congressional districts that we have where most people are safe.
Well, I'll agree with you.
Okay.
I don't agree with you, but
Okay,
on today's
that's
show,
fine.
I'm going to agree
That's
with
fine.
you. So let me ask you the follow-up question. What have you seen, even in the last couple, well, let's go back a decade. What have you seen in the last decade where you think they might have paid attention to public opinion and then actually did something about it, other than maybe the Great Recession?
Well, interestingly, if you look at public opinion on involvement abroad, again, we've always been reluctant about international involvement, but clearly President Obama was aware that Americans were very, as the cliche is used, war-weary. He was aware of what public opinion polls showed about keeping troops in Iraq, keeping troops in Afghanistan. Now, public opinion isn't always right, and maybe those weren't the correct decisions in retrospect. Perhaps we should have kept troops on the ground in Iraq overall, but clearly he was aware of what public opinion was. He clearly was aware of what public opinion was after the crash and the public's desire for greater regulation of Wall Street. Dodd-Frank came about. Perhaps that was too extreme, but still it was a recognition that public opinion said, don't hurt American business as a whole, but do something about these guys on Wall Street.
All right, fair enough. I think you supported your position very nicely there. Thank you. Congratulations. So we talk about dysfunction, we talk about polarization, and before we get to the millennials, one last kind of introductory question. I was reading one of your articles, and you asked the question as to whether or not dysfunction and polarization had its roots in Watergate. And I have not seen people connect the dots that way before. So I'm wondering what made you ask the question, and what do you think the answer to the question is?
Well, what made me ask the question was because I started looking at public opinion data from the Watergate time, and I looked at Democrats and Republicans' views, for example, of President Nixon. There was a chasm in their views about President Nixon, a chasm like there is about Barack Obama today, and I thought, gee, has this been with us longer than we think? And maybe it was just the Nixon presidency specifically. I mean, there were times when we were more more united, let's say 1984 and 1985, 2000, 2001, both cases when the economy was doing very, very well, and that pulled us back together again, made us feel more optimistic across the board. But I just wanted to raise the issue that perhaps polarization is not something that's new. Certainly the levels of polarization are greater than they've been in a long time. There's no question about that. But a number of historians have gone back and have said that it's unusual, that polarization is more the norm than the exception throughout our history. Again, I'm not a historian nor a political scientist, and so I really can't support that. But I think it's interesting to think about it, that we've actually been polarized at other points in time, and that perhaps this is worse than it's been before. But it may always have been a feature of our politics.
And that's one thing we've talked about. Polarization, I think, is part of politics.
Yes,
you always have it.
absolutely.
The question is, how much do you have?
Yeah.
But even in times, back in Illinois, when I've been lobbying, as my viewers know, I lobbied there.
Yeah.
And I go back to the 90s in Illinois.
Yeah.
We had a Republican leader of the Senate then. We had Democratic leader of the House. Speaker Madigan's been a speaker for a million years.
Yeah.
I don't even know if they got along or, went out and had beers together, but they could solve problems.
Sure.
And that, to me, is the biggest difference. It's not whether you have the polarization or even the extent of the polarization. The question is, can you overcome that to solve problems? And that's what seems to be happening now. We don't overcome that anymore. We're not solving any problems.
We certainly haven't done it recently, but if you think back to Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, they worked together on welfare reform.
Back in the 90s, right.
Yeah, back in the 90s. So it can happen, and I think a lot has to do with the personalities of the people involved. I mean, the polarization is pretty ugly and deep in Washington. I don't like it at all. And perhaps a new president, for example, Hillary Clinton, has suggested that she would do things differently from Barack Obama. She certainly has a lot of wonderful relationships if she's elected with Democrats in the Senate and Republicans in the Senate, a lot of whom had very high marks for her Senate tenure overall. It could be different.
And actually, one last tangent here.
Sure.
One of my prior guests, we were talking about Ira Shapiro, who wrote the book, The Last Great Senate. And I was talking to him, and I suggested that one of my disappointments, perhaps in President Obama, is that having come out of the Senate and being the last president out of the Senate in 40 years since Kennedy?
Long time.
Long time.
Yeah.
That you would have thought he would know how to play that card, work the Senate a little bit to get results.
But
Mr. Shapiro suggested that since President Obama got to the Senate, he almost started running for the president right away and didn't get the Senate per se.
Yeah.
Whereas, let's say, if Hillary Clinton were elected, I agree with you. She knows how that game is played, and I think she could work it better, and maybe even the polarization notwithstanding, know how to, butt heads together a little better.
Could be.
Right, well, we could probably
continued.
We could do a whole show on this part.
That's right. We could.
But we're here to talk about millennials.
Great.
So let me ask you this: How do you define millennials, or is there just a classic definition of millennial that you live with anyway?
We tend to think of them as 18 to 30-year-olds in terms of public opinion, though there's no successor generation that's been named at this point. I've heard a few things floated as ideas for a successor generation, but in terms of the adult group, it's 18 to 31, 32.
How does that name happen, by the way? The same four of you that get together for dinner? Do you name the next generation?
I'm not sure who coined the name the millennials. Certainly two very impressive individuals, Bill Strauss and Neil Howe, many years ago wrote a book on generations, and they coined names for various generations, and they started an industry. One of them has passed away, but they started an industry of sorts where they look at generations. Paul Taylor, most recently of the Pew Research Center, has written a book about the millennials, about this new generation, and Paul's work is really excellent in terms of thinking about their ideas. So.
That would be fun to go down and as the one who got to name a generation, right?
Exactly.
How cool would that be?
It would be very cool.
Maybe we should collaborate and come up with the next one.
Good
right?
idea. Good idea.
Although I don't have any children in it, so I don't know how to think of a name for it.
That's a good idea.
All right, so that's the group, 18 to 30 roughly. And when you look through your prisms and you look at this and you're wearing your political hat,
Right.
as opposed to like your police issue hat and the other hat be your purely political hat. What are the characteristics of the millennials that you think are the leading characteristics that we should be thinking about?
Millennials are skeptical of big institutions. They're not hostile to them. They're skeptical about big government. They don't think, for example, they'll see a Social Security check, but they're not hostile to government. They're skeptical about big business. They've known a lot of people who've been laid off, but they're not hostile to business overall. A third of them are the product of divorce. They're a little bit skeptical about the idea of marriage, though they do say they want to marry overall. So I think that skepticism is perhaps for me a significant definition of this group overall. They are they're very much a wait-and-see generation in a number of areas. They've cast their first votes for Democrats. It remains to be seen whether that will continue because people tend to become a little bit more conservative as they age. But this skepticism of big institutions is interesting to me. They seem much less interested in national politics than in doing things at their state and local level. Perhaps that's because a lot of them have had a civic service requirement, and that seems to be imbued in this generation, the idea of service. So I think there's some silver linings to their lack of interest in national level politics.
How about some of the underlying statistics, though? I mean, this is a very racially diverse group, right?
Yeah.
They are marrying at an interracial level more than ever before.
Much more.
If I understand it correctly, there's an immigrant element that is higher than we've had since maybe the 1920s or 30s.
Absolutely.
But a different immigrant element is an Asian component that we hadn't had before and some other things. So are any of these things in their backgrounds between the racial aspect or the immigrant aspect or living at home, any of those kind of things that you think lend themselves to the conclusions in terms of participation?
They're distinct in many ways. They're less conventionally religious. That may come with age. Only 2% of them have served in the military. They may think differently about involvement abroad because of the few that have served in the military overall. They're much more racially and ethnically diverse. There are some interesting splits in that. Young white millennials voted for Romney. African American, Latino, and Hispanic Americans voted for Obama in the last election, but this racial diversity is certainly a hallmark of this generation. And it's going to, and so is the intermarriage, which is happening more and more in the society as a whole among various groups overall. All of those things, I think, will affect their politics at some level. They are on most social issues, they're pretty liberal, certainly on gay marriage, on legalization of marijuana. They're leading change, as the youngest group in the electorate often does. But on abortion, they look a little bit more conservative than their older brothers and sisters, and that's something that no one expected. Perhaps they've all seen a sonogram of their little brother. I'm not sure exactly why that's the case, but that's the one issue that stands out that doesn't follow the conventional pattern of greater social liberalism with each generation. One of the most interesting things in terms of looking at public opinion and age groups over time is many years back in one of the exit polls, they asked a very fine age break, very, very narrow age categories. And the youngest generation was the most liberal, most democratic in the population, but the second most liberal generation in the voting group in the population was people over the age of 80. People who had grown up during the Great Depression, formed their first views of politics during the Depression, and carried those views with them as they aged. And that's one of the things that the big question mark about the millennials. They voted for Barack Obama twice. They didn't turn out in record numbers in most of the off-year elections, and the Obama campaign and Democrats in general are very concerned about their turnout this fall. But we'll see whether or not that the anchor that voting for a Democratic president first gave them will continue as they've aged.
Do you think that people such as yourself and these other people you mentioned that are in your profession, do you think as we move along with the millennials, you will look for parallels to the Depression era? That maybe the Great Recession and the Depression era will produce some of the same reactions to the political world? It's
possible that it will. We thought maybe 9/11 would be a defining experience for this generation. It's possible that this very prolonged economic slowdown will be a defining experience for this generation, and that may incline them more toward Democrats. It may incline them in a different way as they age.
How about in terms of the way they communicate? Obviously, you know, my kids are all millennials by definition. I guess my baby just slides in under the wire there. But they don't talk on the phone. They don't have communication the way I did growing up, perhaps the way you did growing up. They tweet, so they're limited to 140 characters. I don't know where they get their news from. So how much of this internet world they're growing up with and this fast communication world do you think will affect their political views?
I don't know how it's going to affect their political views, but it's certainly real. And what's interesting is that the work that Pew's done, they look at the group in smaller increments. Your youngest child and her cohort may have very different views from your oldest child about technology use, but it's certainly a defining principle of this generation.
Well, I know if I want to communicate with my kids, it has to be through text.
Through text,
That's it.
I know. I'm really behind the curve on all of these
And they'll say, Dad, I called you. I said, well, you didn't leave a message. Well,
Yeah.
I don't leave messages.
They are entirely different. I have a lot of interns at AEI every summer, and to get them to make a phone call is really hard because that's not the way they communicate.
So there was a reason Roop, is it Roop?
Reason Rupee, I think.
Reasonable poll. And they're now calling them the politically unclaimed generation. I guess you would agree?
I think I would agree. Half of them define themselves, or nearly half define themselves as independents. That means they're up for grabs in many ways. If you ask them whether they lean toward the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, which is a follow-up question most of the pollsters ask, they lean a little bit more Democratic, but still, that 50% number is very important to watch going forward.
And one thing, I don't know if you've seen their poll that I found of interest, and I saw a young woman who represents them on television. And I think, you know, polls kind of can get you the results you want based upon how the poll is designed or how you ask the right questions. They found that for this particular generation, they had to start asking the questions differently. For instance, they asked about socialism, and they got one answer. But then they redefined socialism in words, and they got a totally different answer, which suggests there's a disconnect. So maybe to get a better read on this generation, not similar to my question about the internet, but just in terms of how they communicate or the words they use, the polling has to be tailored a little better to get the right result.
I never look at a single poll question and make judgments based on that. And we've seen a lot of polling questions among the millennials recently about socialism and capitalism, and I don't feel I've seen enough really to know what this generation thinks about those terms. I mean, socialism sounds good, it sounds sort of utopian, and so a lot of them like it, but that may not be at base what they're really thinking.
Now, you wrote an article, and again, I said I had so much fun preparing for today. And you're suggesting that there was an ambition gap? Is that what you call it?
Well, I think there's an ambition gap about politics for young men and young women overall, with young women being just less interested. And a lot of academics say, well, that's because there are significant kinds of bias against young women in politics. I'm not sure I see it that way. I just think that young women have different preferences. First of all, politics isn't very attractive to either men or women. If you go back to the Gallup questions of the 1940s, when they only asked about men, they asked a question about whether or not you'd like to see a son, if you had a son, going to choose politics as a life's work. And only a small number, about 25%, said that they wanted a son to choose politics as a life's work. Well, they started asking the question again in the 90s about daughters and if you had a daughter or son, and still that number is very small. Politics isn't very attractive. People associate it with corruption. That's been true for a very long time. And so I think millennials are a little bit skeptical about political involvement at the national level overall. But I think there is an ambition gap between men and women. I mean, certainly young women and young millennials, and this is very distinctive. Young millennial women are getting higher levels of education than young millennial men. They're surpassing them in a lot of areas, not the sciences necessarily, but in a lot of other areas. They're just making different choices, and for a lot of young women, politics is not an attractive choice. But clearly, both parties are doing what they can to recruit more women to become involved in politics, and both parties are having a lot of success.
I know the numbers are up.
The numbers are up.
And we had Frida Walson on the show, who I know you know. And we also had Blanca O'Leary, who's her Democratic counterpart here. And I asked both of them, given the dysfunction, do we need more women to bring a slant to the discussion, perhaps, and would that help break the cycle? I'm not asking you to answer, but I'm saying I put that out to them, but I kind of feel that way. So how do we get this generation interested? How do we get these young women to decide to want to step up, perhaps?
I'm not sure that we can about national level politics, but we certainly can about state and local politics and all the needs that we have at the excuse me, at the state and local level. I mean, I don't think a lot of people go home at night and decide that they're going to read, you know, the Senate rules on the filibuster or something like that. I mean, you know, is it a choice between that? No, nobody does that. So they're just not that interested in national level politics. But in something that's more immediate, the needs of the community in Aspen, I think you can involve young men and women in a much more significant way that's been done in the past. And interestingly, that civic service requirement in high school, I think is, a lot of people don't like it, but I actually think it's produced a generation that really does understand and want to be more involved in the needs of local communities, and that's a real plus for the society.
I agree with you. One of the things we talk about on the show is we don't try to get people to run for office, we just try to get them involved. And if they get involved locally, etc., I think later they may make that leap. And they've seen the success they could drive at a local level by taking an issue and resolving it. They may want to take that to a higher level. And a higher level, I don't know, but a different level.
But the political ambition gap has been there for a very, very long time. My colleague Jean Kirkpatrick, whom most people, the late Jean Kirkpatrick, whom most people associate with foreign policy, actually wrote her first book, the first book ever to study women in politics in 1973. And she argued that what she did was interview a group of women who decided to go into politics and talk about the impediments. And a lot of those impediments are still there. I mean, it's hard to raise money, it's hard to be away from your family, and women just seem less interested in that than men.
It's interesting you say be away from the family. The first my first interaction with a female candidate was in the 90s again, and she was getting back into the workforce, so to speak, and she chose politics. She was good at it, but she had gone through the family raising years. And I know there's a lot of women who step back that are now getting back, whether it's in their late 30s or 40s or something. So again, maybe we'll have that awakening at the political level.
It's quite possible, because certainly there's a big push to get more women involved. And one of the interesting stories of this election campaign that's been hardly written about at all is we're going to see some very big changes in state houses. And you know, they were sort of below the congressional radar, the senatorial radar, but the Republicans had a goal of recruiting 300 women to vote, to get involved in politics, to run in state legislative elections. They got 588. And so what you're building with women at the state legislative level is a B team, people who are going to move up through the ranks. Who are
I call it the farm system.
The farm system is exactly what it is, and that's what's going to happen over time. These women are going to become more involved in politics and move up the ladder, and you're going to see a lot more women in politics. I mean, it's not going to change overnight. It's hard to get those men who've been in those seats in Congress out. I mean, women win just as often as men at every level of politics in America today. It's just getting more women to run.
Now, one of my pet issues, which I told you about, is the fact that we need a third political party. If the millennials are in fact the kind of unclaimed, do you think if someone started a third party movement, it would interest them? Do you think there's enough deflection available to get them to pay attention to something like that?
I think it's possible. Third parties are really popular in the abstract, but believe it or not, in the polls taken right before a major national election, usually the pollsters ask people whether you're satisfied with the candidates the Democratic and the Republican Party have, and you find a lot of levels of satisfaction, despite this generalized dissatisfaction with the two parties as a whole. So they're much more popular in the abstract than in reality, as we've seen in all recent elections, but obviously Ross Perot got 20% of the vote or 19% of the vote. That's pretty significant. And I think it is possible that a candidate could bring millennials to a third party.
I don't know if you're aware of this fact. It's a fun fact I used in the last show. In Nevada, for some reason, it is mandated in the primary that none of the above is a choice, and none of the above won the primary for the Democratic gubernatorial election.
I know.
I know you're shaking your head, but
it's really discouraging, isn't it? Yes, But people came out to vote for none of the above, so.
Exactly. Well, I told you, time flies when you're having fun.
It does.
So we've exhausted our time. So hopefully you'll come back to Aspen and we can have you back on the show. You're a great guest.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it.
All the best.
You.